Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And this is part 2 of our conversation on the Liberal Party of Canada and each leader of the Liberal Party, who have often been prime ministers of Canada. And we're going to talk about their socio-economic legacy as well as some other stuff. And who better than to have on than Tyler Shipley. And Tyler is the professor of society, culture, and commerce in the Department of Liberal Studies at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. He holds a PhD in political science from York University, and he's also the author of 2 books, Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras, and Canada and the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. And he's had articles published in Canadian Dimension, Rabble.ca, The Canada Files, and Socialist Project.ca. And he's also featured in the docu-series on Canada's history of imperialism, Shoot to the Powerless. So, Tyler, first off, thanks so much for coming back on the program.
Always good to be here.
Always an honor to have you. And so, Tyler, so the last time we were talking about Pierre Trudeau, but we had to abruptly cut it off because you had another appointment. So, talk to us about Pierre Trudeau's legacy, the good, the good, the bad, and some of the ugly.
It's all bad and ugly, Youri. You know this. Yeah, so, I don't remember entirely sort of what I had said last time, but I know that in this moment, something that is important to kind of look back on about the Pierre Trudeau era is the concerted effort to start building a distinct Canadian national identity. And I say this not necessarily to flag it as a good thing, but certainly to flag it as an important thing, especially in this moment. I actually think this bears heavily on the situation in 2025, which, I think most people will sort of be aware. Justin Trudeau has resigned. The Liberal Party is a mess. None of the Liberal leaders seem to offer anything. And the Conservative Party has like a 20-point lead in the polls. It looks like there should be a Conservative landslide coming. But I'm not actually convinced that's going to happen. I think a lot depends on sort of what drama plays out with Donald Trump and the United States and the relationship between Canada and the United States. And this brings me back to why I think the Pierre Trudeau era is important. The Canadian middle class, the Canadian working class, didn't have a strong national identity through most of Canadian history. There were regional identities. There were certainly diasporic national identities. Ukrainians in Winnipeg felt Ukrainian. People were connected still to their diasporic communities, but a frustration that the Canadian ruling class often had was a lack of a coherent, united national identity. In the Trudeau era, one of their main objectives was to build that, to repatriate, and have a distinct Canadian flag, a Canadian charter, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, essentially a constitution type document, which is created during the Trudeau era. Several steps are taken to try to create a Canadian identity. And I was just saying to someone the other day, I remember going to school in the 1990s. I remember how much of my schooling involved talking about Canada, talking about what Canada meant, what it was to be Canadian, what was the Canadian identity. There was so much of this, begins in the 70s, really takes form in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of it is simply a repudiation of the United States. Like there is nothing distinctive about the Canadian settler colonial apparatus vis-a-vis any other, except that it was not the other, right? It's the only distinctive thing about Canada is that it isn't the United States, that it did not get annexed by the US. And so, frankly, that's what the Canadian identity was built around. It was built around not being the US. And then a series of other sort of bits and pieces that get added to that story, peacekeeping. This absolute nonsense legacy of peacekeeping, which in another episode with you, I'm sure I've probably debunked a lot of the glory of the peacekeeping era, peacekeeping missions that end up with Canadians murdering teenagers for sport. Nevertheless, most Canadians still believe that peacekeeping is somehow inherent in our national identity, in our national who we are as a country.
And Trudeau piggybacked on of that after the legacy of Lester Pearson, I believe, or
Yes, absolutely. But I don't think during the Pearson era, I don't think there was such a strong effort to really create and inculcate that national identity as much as there was during the Trudeau era. That's when it really ramps up. Um, and I think I think it took time, for that stuff to form. And it took a lot of proactive measures like Canadian content laws, which in some ways people laughed about, but, they were these kinds of forms of, I don't really want to call them affirmative action, but attempts to force Canadian people to consume a certain amount of Canadian content in order to therefore feel like they have some connection to an imagined Canadian community. So I listened to indie rock in the 90s, and I listened to a lot of Canadian indie rock. So in Winnipeg, I'm listening to Winnipeg bands, but I'm also listening to Toronto bands and Nova Scotia bands. And this was all constructed to build a kind of Canadian identity so that now in the 2020s, a lot of people in Canada feel Canadian. They think that is a real thing. They think there is a real thing to be Canadian, that it's an actual and distinct identity, an actual and distinct community of some kind, and that it means something, and that it means something good. I obviously disagree that it means something, and especially that it means something good. I think if there is a Canadian identity, it's sanctimonious version of liberal capitalism and colonialism. It's white supremacy with smugness about how nice it is. But all that is to say, the Trudeau era is when this really gets consciously constructed and lays the foundations for it. It's important right now, and we can come back to this later in the interview if you prefer, Youri, if you want to kind of keep it chronological. But it's important right now because right now in the 2020s, Donald Trump is at the very least performing a kind of rhetoric that is anti-Canadian and that talks about threatening Canadian sovereignty, right? He's threatening to apply massive tariffs and talking openly about annexing Canada into the United States and making it the 51st state, which I don't think he is actually going to do. But the fact that he is doing this is creating a really uncomfortable situation for the Conservative Party of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Because they love Donald Trump. They want to be Donald Trump. They mobilize the same base with the same politics, the same kinds of attitudes, the same kinds of policies, and yet they have Donald Trump openly threatening and mocking Canada. And so they have to position themselves against Donald Trump or not. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Daniel Smith is going down to Mar-a-Lago and kissing his ass. Doug Ford is trying to do a big, oh, no, you can't speak to us that way, but Doug loves Trump. They're very split. They're very confused as to how to respond. And so Donald Trump has given the Liberal Party, since that's our focus today, the Liberal Party a gift, an absolute gift. He's given them their campaign platform, right? He's given them this, and one that will actually resonate, which is, Canadian nationalism, stand up to the bullies of the United States. So we can come back to that if you're interested and you want to talk kind of about the leadership situation now. But that's the one thing I'd flag as a lasting and important consequence of the Pierre Trudeau era, is that sense of Canadian nationalism.
But before we talk about about John Turner and the other leaders that came after him, is there anything in the socio-economic affairs that Trudeau did which you can look on positively or even ones you want to look on negatively? Since the Liberal Party is often a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, just the usual, I mean, different people will remember different pieces. The 1970s is still the era of the welfare state, and so the welfare state, which had been built through liberal and conservative governments after the Second World War, it persists into the 1970s and into the early 1980s. But if we think about the neoliberal turn, the turn against the welfare state, against working people, against unions, cutting taxes for the rich, we associate all that with the conservatives, the Mulroney conservatives. But
Yep.
really, it's the Trudeau era where that starts. By the early 1980s, it's Pierre Trudeau that already has started that process. Because as I said to you in our last interview, I don't think that the changing fortunes of the Canadian working classes, and the changing dynamics of class war in Canada, I don't think they have very much to do with which party is in power. I think they have to do with the broader political economic context of whichever government is in office. And by the late 70s, early 80s, the context is the ruling class is sick of sustaining a welfare state to boost the consumption of the working classes. They feel that it's cutting into their ability to generate profits, and they're sick of it. And the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States is a really, key moment where the business class is put back into, the driver's seat with respect to socioeconomic policies, internal and domestic socioeconomic policies. So, what is a key moment in the turn to neoliberalism in Canada? I would say it's the crushing of the Canadian postal workers strike, and the imprisonment of the leader of the postal workers union, Jean-Claude Perrault, after the strike, after postal workers stayed on strike, defied back to work legislation, and stayed on strike. To me, that's it's like each of the Anglo-American economies had their neoliberal moment. And for Ronald Reagan, it was firing all the air traffic controllers.
Who ironically supported him, funny enough.
I know. For Margaret Thatcher, it was crushing the miners' strike. And I would say for Canada, it was Pierre Trudeau's imprisoning of Jean-Claude Perrault and crushing of the postal workers' strike. So again, I don't view the shifting dynamics in Canada as being closely related to which party's in office. I view them as part of the broader socioeconomic dynamics that are hitting all of these capitalist settler states.
Interesting. Now, Trudeau would be succeeded by John Turner, who was Prime Minister of Canada very briefly in the early 80s, and from June 16, 1984 to September 1984. How do you look back on his time in office and his legacy?
I mean, honestly, there's not much to say. He's a Bay Street guy. He's in office for a few weeks, I think, a couple months maybe. I think he just represents a continuation of the Pierre Trudeau era. He was in Pierre Trudeau's cabinet. He represented the business elite within the Liberal Party, although that is pretty much all of them. But I mean, he in particular he'd been a finance minister, so he was particularly tight with Bay Street. But he was also like a lame duck prime minister who was the dregs of an era that had exhausted its popularity with the electorate, right? And I mean, a lot of this stuff it's electoral politics.
Unbelievable the similarities now, or the
Yeah. Oh,
similarities that keep coming
absolutely.
up.
Oh, yeah. John Turner is a Mark Carney, right? Like if Mark Carney, ascended to be the leader of the Liberal Party, we would forget him as quickly as we forgot John Turner. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a. There's not much to say there. It's a continuation of the Liberal Party. It's a. Their popularity with the electorate was exhausted after all of those years of Pierre Trudeau, who, like Justin, mobilized a lot of language, a lot of hope. I'm going to say
Yeah.
among very naive people, but mobilized a lot of hope among very naive people that he would somehow make life a lot better. After a decade or so, it was like, okay, not much has changed. And so, as often happens in Canadian politics, everyone just kind of shifts over. And I think if you look at the ensuing eras in Canadian politics, it's like they each get a decade. You know, the Libs get a decade, the Conservatives get a decade, the Libs get a decade, the Conservatives get a decade. We go back and forth, and I think that's because, especially in this period, especially in that moment from about the late 70s to roughly now to the early 2020s, the Liberal and Conservative parties became almost indistinguishable politically, almost identical. And you know me, I would argue that they basically always were anyways, but in particular, in that era, the Liberals swing hard to the right. They become neoliberals. They're committed to that neoliberal project. The Conservatives were always that. They're still in that. And so from the 1980s to the 2020s, I think those two parties are virtually indistinguishable, and their electoral, fate hangs on whether they have a marketable leader in a given moment, whether they have a leader that is able to, Jean Chretien had some quips that were funny and people liked, right? Stephen Harper was something different. So I think that's the pendulum swinging back and forth over that ensuing 40-year period is it's just that, it's superficial stuff.
Well, that's a perfect segue to this one. So Turner lost his job as prime minister when he was unseated by a huge progressive conservative wave led by Brian Mulroney, who introduced. Yeah. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me, Tyler?
I lost you for a second. It froze for a second, but came back.
Okay, sorry about that. So Turner lost his job as prime minister when he was unseated by a huge progressive conservative wave led by Brian Mulroney, who introduced Reaganomics, Rogernomics, monetarism to Canada, mass privatization, and the start, officially, of endless austerity. Free trade with the U.S., which later became NAFTA, the drug war, tough on crime policies, and certainly no friend to the working class and to a faction of the middle class. Turner would remain leader of the opposition from 1984 to 1990. The month of June, the Liberal Party had a new leader who would become prime minister after a decade of progressive conservative rule under Mulroney and the brief period of his successor, Kim Campbell. Jean Chretien, who was elected October 1993 and remained prime minister, elected two more times until his time in office ended November 13, 2003. So tell us about Chretien, whose legacy on socio-economic affairs, and I had Barry Weisletter of the NDP Socialist Caucus and Socialist Action in Canada, looking at the history of the NDP and each federal party leader's legacy. When we talked about the period of Chretien, I said he was the Canadian Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and that he brought endless austerity, more corporatism, and what was called the third way neoliberalism, which was just continuing the policies of the more outwardly previous right-wing administration of Mulroney and Campbell, correct?
Yeah, you said it. I don't really need to say anything, Youri. You got it. That's it. Um, that's the Chretien liberals. That's, I think it would be fair to argue that every liberal government, from the 1970s onward was more right-wing than the previous liberal government, and in some cases more right-wing than the previous conservative governments. In fact, I think it would actually probably be fair to say that the Chretien era was a more right-wing era in Canadian politics than the Mulroney era. The Mulroney era, Mulroney was still overseeing, a state that had the vestiges of the welfare state. You were right to point to the privatizations, the wave of privatizations under Mulroney, but there was a wave of privatizations under Chretien, all of the things that Mulroney hadn't got to. And so, I think you said it. And, again, what I would point to is, from the 80s, in the 80s, it's Mulroney. In the 90s, it's Chretien. In the 2000s, it's Harper. I'm, stretching the dates a little, but in the 2000s, it's Harper. In the 2010s, it's Justin, and those four eras is 4 decades and essentially 4 eras where it swings back and forth between the Liberals and Conservatives. And I would argue that is because, as I say, politically, and certainly, in terms of real politics, actual policies, they become virtually indistinguishable. Now, having said that, I think that by the early 2000s, sort of nearing the end of the Chretien era, there starts to be a sort of a more obvious shift in the language that the parties mobilize,
And
for the
actually,
same politics.
yeah, and actually, and before we get into that, so Chretien would be succeeded as prime minister by his minister of finance, who he often had an uneasy relation with, Paul Martin, who was often his political rival. Martin became leader of the party and prime minister from November 14, 2003 to March 19, 2006, 21st prime minister. And how do you, how do you assess his legacy then? Because I think because whatever criticism leftists, NDP members, and so forth would say about William Mackenzie King and Liberal prime ministers before that, William Mackenzie King, and then somebody like Lester Pearson or Pierre Trudeau, is you can say under William Mackenzie King, he gave a lot of concessions to the working class, the building of a welfare state, taxing the rich. I mean, under a prime minister of the progressive conservative John Diefenbaker, rich people were still taxed in the 90s, just like when Eisenhower was Republican leader and president. Rich people were taxed in the 90s. This is unfathomable. Like this is like you would not even flirt with the idea of taxing rich people in the 90s. Lester Pearson gave single payer health care. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau did have to give some concessions as well if he wanted to keep his job and so forth. But starting with, as he mentioned, starting with both Trudeau and John Turner, but really with Chretien and Paul Martin, we get neoliberalism, and we actually get these people who as is often said about the Liberal Party, they campaign from the left, but they govern from the right. So so talk to us about a bit more about Paul Martin then. Oh,
I think I lost you again. You're frozen again
yeah.
there.
Sorry
Okay.
about that. Internet. Yeah, yeah.
No, no,
Go on.
that's okay. Yeah, no, I mean, everything you're saying is right, and I think, um, yeah, there becomes an entrenched neoliberal position within the Liberal Party as of. I mean, I think it starts with Pierre Trudeau, but absolutely as of that era in the 1990s with Chretien and Paul Martin. But again, for me, that's the political economic moment. Like that is what's happening in the U.S. That's what's happening in the U.K. That's what's happening in all of the settler economies and metropolitan economies too. I mean, that's what's happening in a lot of mainland Europe as well, and what's being imposed on the rest of the world by countries like Canada and the United States, by liberal and conservative governments. So, for me, it's none of this is really about which party is in office. And I think that when you sort of gave that list of like positive things that liberal governments had done, but I think in every single case, it's what's operative here is to what extent are they being pushed to do those things? To what extent are they being forced, maybe having their hand forced? And I think that's, I'll use the example, if I didn't already in the previous episode, of the 1973 coup in Chile, and a democratic government is overthrown, and military and killed, and military rule is imposed in Chile, and Canada immediately recognizes the military government and says, and Andrew Ross says, we see no reason to withhold recognition. So Canada moves forward to recognize that government as the official government of Chile and to open up new loans, new IMF loans that will be given to the military regime that had just murdered a president and taken over. And yet, Pierre Trudeau is also credited with having brought a large wave of Chilean refugees from that crisis over to Canada. And this might seem like a contradiction, and of course, hagiographic biographers will write about, oh, he was so torn, as if it was just everything that happens, just it's in the mind of the prime minister and his whims and which way. No, what happened was Andrew Ross, who was the Canadian highest official in Chile, sent a bunch of cables back to Ottawa that were atrocious, where he basically laughed at what was happening and said, Pinochet, the new military dictator, is just clearing out the riffraff of the Latin American left. Well, he is murdering people in the national stadium. Like this nightmare has descended on Chile, and the Canadian ambassador is cabling Ottawa saying, no, it's great, everything's cool. This gets leaked. A junior member of the Canadian Foreign Service in Chile leaks those documents to the press. The press say, understandably, what the hell? What is this? This is how we're discussing what's happening in Chile? And under pressure from civil society organizations, the Pierre Trudeau government, to save its own reputation, makes this concession to accept Chilean refugees fleeing from the government that he himself, Pierre Trudeau, had given recognition to. So, it's this absurd contradiction, but my point in all of this is to say Pierre Trudeau doesn't deserve any credit for that decision. The Liberal Party doesn't deserve any credit for that decision. It was a Liberal Party ambassador that was cabling Ottawa to say, it's great, they're killing leftists. They don't deserve credit. The credit is, look, it just so happens, I have this book on my desk because I've been reading it. It is a book about, specifically, the civil society mobilizations in that era to force the Trudeau government into the concession of allowing Chilean refugees.
Is it safe to
I
say
would apply that to all of these cases.
Safe to say that is it safe to say that? Well, actually, let me just get into this. So, Paul Martin continues on the endless austerity of Chretien, who was consuming that from previous prime ministers. When Martin lost the election and Canada found itself in the Stephen Harper conservative era, I love, and I have to paraphrase what I'm paraphrasing what my friend Barry was saying. Barry said that before Martin lost the election, he was promising everything and anything to corporate Canada, the working class unions, and to whomever, and delivering very little. And I jokingly said, typical liberal. So why do you think Martin lost to Harper, which Dimitri Lascaris said that Harper's victory Harper's victory over Paul Martin was very much like Mulroney's victory in Canada after a long period of liberals talking left when running for office, governing from the right. The left voters only vote for them to keep the Tories out, engaged in ridiculous tactical voting, which both Dimitri and Barry strongly discourage. But eventually, the right wing, the more outwardly right wing, gets into office with a weak left unable to block it. Your thoughts on this before we talk about the last two Liberal prime ministers?
Yeah, I think, during each of these sort of, roughly a decade, between the 80s and the 2020s, each party kind of governing for about a decade and then flipping over. In each of these moments, I think the party in opposition was sort of usually in a kind of reconstruction period. And if, during the Chretien Martin era, the Conservatives were a mess, right? In fact, the Conservative Party had split. There had been the creation of a new, further right-wing party, the Reform Party, which kind of presaged some of the things that actually are hitting harder now. But, it was this kind of like, okay, the Conservatives need to catch up. The Liberals have turned hard to the right, and the Liberals have taken the political space that the Conservatives once held, which is the right. So what are the Conservatives going to do? They have to go further right. They have to find some space to carve out an identity for themselves politically, again, in terms of, electoral politics. And so that's what they do. And it takes a while, right? There is the emergence of the Reform Party, the Conservatives hang on. All of this division of the right is great news for Chretien, who gets to just, ride this period. ride it out and stay in office. And that's how Martin even really survives as long as he does, because he was immensely unpopular and uncharismatic. But the Conservatives eventually pull all of these different things together, and they recalibrate and reconstitute themselves, and Harper is the guy through which they do that, and he's the kind of the figurehead of that reoriented Conservative government that has carved out a space, or at least a rhetoric, even more right-wing than the most right-wing Liberal government that had ever existed, which was that of Chretien Martin. And that's the Stephen Harper era. It's a continuation politically. It's a continuation, an almost uninterrupted continuation, with a few exceptions. I mean, I know people will say, "Oh, but what about the way he attacked the public service?" And if you were a public servant, the Harper era was tough because he slashed a bunch of public service jobs. He centered a lot more power around the Prime Minister's office, taking power away from some of those different departments, within the public service. All of that is true, but I don't think that's because it was a Conservative government necessarily. I think that's just a continuation of where the ruling class parties were at. And yeah, it took, another party jumping in to do it, but it's like you've got two heads of the same machine, which at different times, okay, this one's exhausted, so this one takes over. And a few things change, but, each time it gets more right-wing. And I would argue that's true into the Justin Trudeau era. Superficially,
yeah, exactly.
superficially it might change, but politically, I don't think so.
Yes, and during that period after Paul Martin's and the Liberal Party under him, after their huge loss, the Liberals were in a bit of a wilderness period. They had Stéphane Dion, who, although he very much emphasis on attacking Stephen Harper, because Stephen Harper was such a climate criminal, was such an obstructionist when it came to any kind of climate action, even though the Liberal Party were not, they weren't climate champions either. After Dion lost, there was Michael Ignatieff. Is there anything actually you want to say about Ignatieff before we talk about Justin Trudeau, actually?
I think God, he had the charisma of a potato. I mean, just an absolutely, utterly unlikable loser, who ended up back to teaching political science at the U of T, of which I'll say nothing. But the only thing that's worth noting about Ignatieff is that even as a leader of the opposition, part of what was so uncompelling about Ignatieff as a leader of the opposition was that he wasn't in opposition. It was hard at times to even, he would say that he was against a conservative policy, but you wouldn't be able to even understand substantively what he was against, because he agreed substantively with everything, because the parties were so absolutely interlocked in terms of real policy. Like, this is on my mind because, of course, Palestine is on all of our minds right now. And I remember when Israel murdered a Canadian family in Lebanon during one of their attacks God, could have been any of their attacks.
Exactly.
Sometime in the early 2000s, when Ignatieff was leader of the opposition, and murdered a Lebanese Canadian family while they were visiting family in Lebanon. And Stephen Harper and Michael Ignatieff essentially competed with one another for who could care less about the murder of this Canadian family by Israel. Who could defend Israel more? And I don't have the statements in front of me, but Harper made some kind of statement about Israel. We regret the loss of Canadian life, but Israel is doing what it has to do to protect itself. And Ignatieff kind of took it a step further and not only defended Israel, but added some remark about, like, I'm not losing any sleep about this.
Unbelievable.
And so, I take a moment like that as a kind of a snapshot of that era where these are two right-wing parties fighting over who can sound and be more right-wing, which of course, as a segue into the next sort of moment, is where Justin Trudeau broke from that pattern insofar as he changed the rhetoric. And he went back to, I think, what you were describing earlier, which is talking from the left and governing from the right. It was not working. Trying to be more conservative than Stephen Harper was not connecting with voters. And so the Liberals, eventually settle on Justin Trudeau, who will talk left of the Conservatives. He will carve out, in an electoral sense, he will carve out, the rhetorical space that is just to the left of Stephen Harper. And that's why they won, because people were exhausted with the Harper era, ready for something different. Justin comes along and sounds different. Of course, he
And
wasn't.
that's a perfect segue to this. So, and yes, under Michael Ignatieff, the Liberals faced a huge defeat once again. The NDP for a very brief period of time under Jack Layton, who some people claim is the most popular leader of the NDP, although my friend Barry would disagree with that. Anywho, but yes, but the NDP was riding a huge popular wave. Uh, the and so there was the interim leader was, funny enough, Bob Rae, a former NDP and actually a foreign minister, I believe, under Trudeau from May 25th, 2011 to April 14th, 2013, but he didn't remain party leader. The Liberal Party chose Justin Trudeau, son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who became party leader April the 14th, 2013, and has remained party leader up until him being forced to resign. He would go on to lead the Liberal Party to a huge victory, finally unseating Stephen Harper's Conservative Party and end the era of conservative rule. Important to know that the Reform Party, which you mentioned, was a much more right wing party, which would attack the progressive conservatives from the right, the Liberal Party from the right, under the leadership of Preston Manning, Stephen Harper, and Pierre Poilievre were both part of that party. They became the Canadian Alliance, and then eventually the Canadian Alliance would merge with the Progressive Conservatives. And that's how we have today's modern Conservative Party. So why do you think Trudeau, the son of Pierre Trudeau, was able to mount at the time quite a majority for the Liberal Party? He has since lost that majority, and the two times he was narrowly re-elected, the neo-Trudeau Liberals or neoliberal Trudeaus have been in minority government. And though he didn't need it, he got a supply and confidence government in agreement with the NDP under Jagmeet Singh. Now, Trudeau was recently stabbed in the front by Chrystia Freeland, who many believe has been behind several efforts at undermining Trudeau, attacking him from the right, saying that he's not aggressive enough in promoting NATO and whatnot, and being tough on China. Now that Trudeau has resigned and there is a Liberal Party leadership race, how do you assess his legacy in office overall? And if hypothetically Trudeau had carried on and lost an election to the Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre or whomever he replaces, uh, yeah, yeah. In general, how do you assess Justin Trudeau's legacy then?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, to go back to that sort of talking from the left and governing from the right, I think Justin, like his father, was very good at that. Much better than, a schlub like Paul Martin or Michael Ignatieff, just these absolutely uncharismatic, sacks of empty, just absolutely nothing there that could connect with anyone, right? And I mean, politics has largely become a sort of pantomime, a kind of game, where the two parties, and this I would say has been true of especially that era from the early 80s to the early 2020s, where the two parties really were indistinguishable, and this obviously goes for the US as well, indistinguishable politically. And so what distinguished them was the kind of the personalities of the leaders, the personalities of their figureheads. And so, people like Chretien had some charisma. Stephen Harper had some charisma. I mean, it doesn't work on me.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, and I'm actually largely in agreement with you. There was a bit of a Harper derangement
yeah.
sentiments going on, but I find even though I would never vote for Stephen Harper, you could say that he had charisma and knew how to pitch conservatism to the electorate.
Absolutely, absolutely. He was the right leader for the Conservatives in that moment, insofar as they had gone through this period where there had been a bunch of wackos like Preston Manning, unpopular wackos like Preston Manning, Stockwell Day, these guys who, yeah, they were a representative of the pushing of the party to the right, but they kind of scared a lot of mainstream Canadians. And then Harper took all of that and softened it, made it a little bit more boring, a little bit more bland, made it seem, in fact, like Canada had entered a very bland sort of era, with just this kind of putsy old dad kind of figure in Stephen Harper. He was obviously far more evil than that, but he was good at he had a certain charisma insofar as he could sell what he was doing, by sort of almost playing it down, by being sort of softer than he actually was in many respects. But I mean, that wears itself out over time with the electorate too. And, the weight of various different scandals start to bear, and the war in Afghanistan, which was unpopular in many ways, really wore on the popularity of the Harper government. And so Justin comes along at a perfect moment to do the thing that I described earlier, where suddenly now the other head of the ruling class, jumps up and says, wait a minute, it's gone all wrong. We have to fix this. And so Justin did that from the left of where the Harper Conservatives were anyways, made a bunch of centrist promises that he would never keep, and people should have known that he wouldn't keep them, but people love to get sucked into electoral politics and electoral promises. And so I would say in practice, the Justin Trudeau era was a steady continuation of the Harper era, without
You say
significant divergence
would,
in
would
terms of policy.
would you say the Trudeau era was a lost era of many opportunities, just like just like the '90s, Chretien and Paul Martin afterwards, they come in power with a huge mandate and a huge rebuking of the Brian Mulroney era and whatnot. I think the electorate exaggerated unbelievably when it came to punishing Kim Campbell for the famous face ad, which I'll put in the show notes. Not worth going through it, but it sounds to me as if when we talk about the '90s, that's very much a lost era for Canada. And funny enough, when you look at the debates and when you look at the rise of the Reform Party, when you look at the rise of the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, that Canada's very bitterly divided. People do, like from the outside, it might even shock a lot of people how bitterly divided Canada is, with Western alienation over here, Quebec nationalism over there, and just two parties of like the Liberal Party and even the NDP unable to really galvanize and make Canada into this supposedly much more fair country than what was than what Canada was originally founded on by British settler colonialists, and certainly America with its grotesque levels of income inequality and the ridiculous culture wars and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two reasons that didn't happen. And it's because, yes, Canada was bitterly divided in certain respects in the 90s, but there wasn't a huge section of Canada that wanted radical left reform. Yes, like there was the issue of Quebec sovereignty, and there was a bitter division around that, but we are absolutely kidding ourselves if we think that the Quebec separatist movement was progressive.
Okay.
I mean, it had progressive elements in it in certain moments, but if you'll recall, when the vote came in and it landed just ever so slightly against sovereignty for Quebec, the premier of Quebec at the time said that it was because of the, quote, ethnic vote.
Yeah.
So so we
He
you know
did
we'd be
say that. Yeah,
foolish,
he did
you
say
know.
that. Even if they're
Yeah,
for Quebec independence, he did
yeah.
say that. And of course, the party has only gone ever more to the right ever since.
Exactly, exactly. To the extent that the Bloc Québécois steals votes from one of the two large political parties, I would argue that they borrow votes from the Conservatives more than they do from the Liberals, because they are a right-wing party. You know, same thing if we talk about the so-called Western alienation of that era. That's Alberta capitalists feeling like they aren't getting as many advantages in Canadian capitalism as Ontario capitalists are getting. That's what Western alienation is. That's not progressive. That's not a progressive movement. So,
Exactly.
if we're talking about a missed opportunity, like, I'm not sure that there's that opportunity there. Secondly, it's only a missed opportunity if we imagine that the Liberal Party would ever have made good on its progressive promises. And, I mean, I think we have to be absolute idiots to think that. There's absolutely zero reason to believe the Liberal Party that it has any interest whatsoever in policies that will harm the interests of the capitalist class and benefit the working class. The only times they've ever had a genuine interest in doing that were during the welfare state era, when politically and economically it made sense for the capitalist class. And the role that the state was taking was to manage the contradictions of capitalism between the Second World War and the 1980s, manage the contradictions of capitalism, give the working class a little bit so they can keep buying our shit. That's the only time the Liberal Party, was oriented that way. And at the time, the Conservatives were too. So by the 1990s, by the 2010s, these aren't governments that have any interest in making a better life for working class people. So do I think there's a missed opportunity there? No, not at all. Not in that respect. There's always a missed opportunity in the sense that every moment could be a moment that we're building a revolutionary movement that would supplant and subsume the two-party system that we have, the two-and-a-half-party system that we have, where the ruling class changes its mask every 10 years and changes its rhetoric and flips its rhetoric, but essentially does the same thing. Like, the missed opportunity is every time we aren't building something that would replace that. Every time we aren't investing ourselves in Indigenous struggle against that state, and so on. So I don't see a missed opportunity exactly. I just see the kind of flip-flopping, mask changing of the two parties in different moments as a response to, what I think are ultimately pretty superficial trends in electoral voting patterns. Now, having said all that,
Yeah.
I do think the current moment is a little. There are some differences in the current moment. I know you probably have questions about this moment, and I do think we are entering a period that is going to be a little different. So some of what I said, I do think will change and is changing.
I got a couple of final questions. Let me get to this to this question. So I have to ask, how does the Liberal Party keep getting elected or remaining a dominant force in Canada, which the NDP isn't able to unseat federally and sometimes even locally? And and yeah, actually answer that question first. Like, what is it about the Liberal Party that keeps in which they keep getting elected? Because even during the 90s and early 2000s, unlike Bill Clinton, who makes it very clear, I'm a new Democrat, Tony Blair, I'm
Sure.
I'm New Labor. The Liberal Party always campaigns on talking left, governing right. So what is it about that Liberal Party that keeps that in which the electorate keeps getting fooled and fooled and fooled again?
I mean, I think it's that the NDP is also the same thing. And people, I think, have a pretty acute awareness that the NDP, for the most part, also campaigns left and governs right. Most provinces have had NDP governments at some point in the last 40 years. Certainly every province no, okay, that's not true because Ontario hasn't, I don't think. But most of the provinces have at different moments had NDP governance, and it was the same. Nothing changed. It was all the same shit. So I think that anyone who would look at the Liberals and see the hypocrisy and see the gap brick and right governance would look at the NDP and see the same thing. Anyone who looks at the Liberals, now I'm talking a right-wing person who looks at the Liberals and sees a scary leftist, idiot, but also, you know, they would see the same thing in the NDP. I don't think there's anything distinguishable about the NDP from the Liberal Party. I think it has been decades since the NDP had even remotely occupied a different political position from the Liberals and Conservatives at this point. If we go back to its early days as the CCF and some of the early moments of the NDP, then yeah, I mean, you could say that they were at least carving out a more left liberal position, but those days are long since over. And so I don't think the NDP really is significant, except insofar as they can sometimes kind of swing some of the dynamics of the electoral machine. As you mentioned, when Jagmeet Singh, entered into an agreement with the Liberals to sort of prop up what was a minority government. But I mean, that's a good example. What the hell did that achieve? If that was supposed to be some great moment where the left, the NDP being the left, would somehow have leverage over the Liberals, didn't amount to much.
Jagmeet Singh supporters, and I'm sure the left faction, if that of the Liberals, to say, well, we finally got pharmacare, we finally got some daycare programs, and we finally have expanded dental care to people. But it sounds to me, but is it safe to say, okay, you guys did that, but it's too little, too late, because and that's because it took forever for the Liberal parties to even do that. Had the Liberal Party done that in their very early years, maybe people would be very, forgiving of some of their right-wing policies. But now I think people are just fed up with the Liberal Party. Even if they do, even if they have pushed Justin aside, people are fed up with the Liberal Party. I think the NDP is also going to be punished, hypothetically, if an electorate comes about, and we are going to see a huge conservative comeback. And if not a huge conservative comeback, certainly a conservative minority.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, again, not to be a broken record, but I think that to a certain extent, in this political moment between, in the time that Justin has been in office, I think it's 2015 until now, there has been a need to raise the floor of the working classes in order to sustain the profitability of Canadian capital. We've entered into a protracted crisis of capitalism that began in 2008. And some of those manifestations took a little bit longer to really set in, but certainly by the latter half of the 2010s, you are on the brink of a kind of recession. Didn't really explode until after the pandemic, but it was lingering and it was present and it was in the air. And some of the things that the Liberal government did, whether it is, and I want to say these are all watered down policies that many of which haven't achieved much, will not achieve much, and will not last long. But nevertheless, to the extent that something like introducing a daycare program is a good thing, and it is also a reflection of the understanding by the Liberal government that capitalism needs this, because capitalism needs to keep people working. Capital needs to keep people buying stuff, and too much of people's income was being sucked into daycare and not going into other industries and not circulating through the economic system. And in some cases, it was unsustainable for people to even get daycare programs, and so people were dropping out of the labor force. There were a whole bunch of economic considerations for the Liberal Party from the standpoint of capital for why some of these things made sense. We want to view them as concessions. We want to view them as like, we got something from them. Or some people want to view it as a gift. Oh, they gave us this, that's so nice. But I think that's just such a naive, to me, it's so naive to think that way. Like, these are things that are calculated by, Chrystia Freeland was an instrumental player in a lot of these things. Chrystia Freeland is more right-wing than most people in the Conservative Party. Chrystia Freeland 100% is not doing anything out of some kind of generosity
In
to the
fact,
working class.
in fact, Barry told me that both Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney are actually running to the right of Justin Trudeau. So,
Oh yeah, that's the whole narrative right now. The whole narrative is that the Liberal Party went too far to the left, and to regain their position, they have to make a right turn. Now, I'll say this, if we want to sort of look forward, I'm not a pundit, but if we want to kind of look forward at what's happening, the Conservatives have a 20-point lead, and if the Liberal answer is to try to be more right-wing, they're going to lose. They're going to get their ass kicked. That's not going to work. In fact, I would argue that the Liberals don't have anything that they can do right now, because they just spent 10 years pretending they were of the left and not being of the left. So they can't really keep pretending to be left. But there's no way they're going to be able to be more right-wing than Pierre Poilievre. So they're in a position to absolutely get shit-canned in this election. And I think it would set the stage for, another one of those long decades of conservative, the flip-flopping back and forth. Except, we've already entered an era of just absolute crisis in the world political system, in the world order. Donald Trump's election the first time was a harbinger of where the American empire was at. His election the second time is even more so. Alarm bells should be ringing about the state of the American empire. It's in bad shape. The American empire is crumbling, and I think the questions are not whether it will fall, but how. How will America collapse? Will
and
it
that's
be
and that's
okay?
that's something I'm worried about, because we're going to have to talk about that, but that's going to be a topic for another day. But I will just say the following: that while everybody would welcome the idea of the American empire falling, it does matter how it falls, so that we can transition to a more peace and just world, and not just more reactionary capitalists, replacing the American empires, and certainly, finding somebody who can beat Trump without all of the shock jock baggage. So when we talk about the Liberal Party, how many unions support the Liberal Party often? And is the key to the Liberals not just that a huge faction of the Canadian oligarchy supports them, but a huge faction of the middle class, particularly the upper middle class, the bourgeoisie, if you will, and the Liberals portraying themselves as a centrist big tent? Is that how they keep getting elected when they are attacked by the left from the NCP, attacked by the right from the Conservatives, previously Canadian Alliance, from right before them, and the Progressive Conservatives, even though I find they have much more in common than differences? And I'm curious your response to I'm curious your response to that.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with what you've said, and I think that the Liberal Party, you've said a few times, it has made itself the natural governing party in Canada, and I think that is true, and I think that's really sunk in, and so for a lot of mainstream Canadians, especially those who are in the middle class and above, it's just a sort of natural instinct to keep supporting the Liberals. The NDP is irrelevant, and most people know that, so that they're an afterthought. Switching to the Conservatives doesn't feel Canadian to a certain set of Canadians. I mean, there's a big chunk of middle class and upper middle class Canadians who are so committed to the absolute nonsense idea that Canada is a nice place, a good place, where we're well-intentioned and we want to be a good neighbor and a good member of the international community and do right by people and do right by one another. All of this absolute empty claptrap that runs pretty deep in a section of the Canadian middle class, and they believe it, and they need to believe it. It's how they sleep at night. And so voting liberal is the way they keep sleeping at night. It's the way they feel good about themselves. It's the same as Democrats in the U.S. And the obsessive way in which they criticize Donald Trump, who absolutely is deserving of every criticism lodged at him, but the obsessive way that liberals in the United States criticize Donald Trump for doing identical things to what Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama did or would do. And it's got nothing to do with the actual people involved. It has everything to do with people, liberals, making themselves feel better, convincing themselves that they're the good guy, that they're one of the good ones. They're trying. I'm still voting liberal. So I think that is why the Liberal Party, survives and keeps coming sort of back to the front. Now, right now,
as well as the fact that they get away by just appearing to be centrist and appealing enough of a big tent that you can promise enough stuff to win people over. But as you govern, you take care of your oligarchic friends.
yeah, and that is another part of it too that you mentioned that is correct, which is that they have a huge section of the oligarchy behind them. I think right now, like there is an interesting, maybe that's not the right word, but things are shifting in Canadian politics because the Canadian oligarchy is divided, and it has been divided, over the last period of time, but especially now, there are chunks of the oligarchy that are absolutely backing the Conservatives, and that's especially the oil and gas, type industries. And then, the Liberal Party has the backing of the banks and finance and telecoms, and, there's industries that tend to side with one party or the other. But I do think right now it's going to be an interesting stretch because all things being equal, I think the Conservatives are going to cruise to a victory over whichever unpopular, whichever dud the Liberal Party puts forward. Either the very, I think, very disliked Chrystia Freeland, or the absolutely irrelevant rest of them, Mark Carney and all the others whom nobody, they're John Turners, they're absolutely forgotten, meaningless footnotes. Chrystia Freeland is the only one who has any kind of recognition, any kind of, presence in the Canadian electorate's mind, but a lot of it's bad. So, she's not very well positioned, except that the election of Donald Trump has thrown this bizarre wrench into the mix. Because in the context of a failing US empire, Trump is sort of desperately trying to find ways. I think Trump at some level understands, maybe better than some of the people around him, that the US is in crisis, that the empire is fading, and he's trying to shore up the US empire in part by bullying the my friend Jerome would say the vassal states, the kind of the subordinate members of the US empire, the Canadas, the Frances, the Denmarks, to a certain extent the Mexicos, like those states that are participating in US empire, benefiting from US empire. Trump is trying to sort of rein in and bully his vassal states. Canada being one of them. And I think he wants specific concessions from Canada about contributions to NATO and other things. Mm-hmm. But in doing this, and in doing it in his Trump over-the-top sort of way, and threatening this trade war, these tariffs, and threatening, annexation, he has handed the Liberal Party a gift from an electoral standpoint. From an actual policy standpoint, if Trump goes ahead with tariffs, it's bad for the Canadian economy, it's bad for the US economy. It's a self-defeating, it's a Pyrrhic victory from Trump's standpoint if he does that, but all bets are off. It's a failing empire with an absolute maniac at the head, so anything can happen. And it would be bad. But from an electoral standpoint, not that I'm a pundit, not that I care to be a pundit, but if you're doing punditry, Trump has given the Liberals a gift because they had absolutely nothing from a kind of a campaign position standpoint. They had nothing. We already discussed this. They can't pretend to be left. They can't outright the Conservatives. But what they can do is they can say, we will be tough on Donald Trump. And that will tap into that middle-class Canadian heart. Oh, the sanctimony the certainty that we Canadians are better, that we would never, we're not going to do a deal with that bully. We're going to stand up to that bully. I mean,
Yeah.
that is just ready-made. That is soup. That is just, yeah, I mean, there's nothing better. And the Liberals are perfectly positioned to do that because they don't historically have the link to Donald Trump and the far right that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have. So the Conservatives are all over the place in the last couple weeks. I mean, it's funny to watch. Some of them kissing Trump's ass, some of them saying they're going to be strong against him. And, you know, like, this is always the contradiction of right-wing nationalistic politics. Right-wing nationalists always like one another because they share a certain view of the world. But
Yeah,
they
'cause
come into conflict, because you know, their politics are nationalistic, and as soon as those nations have any kind of rivalry, well, all of a sudden they've got a problem, right? I was saying to someone the other day, it's like Italians in 1943 being invaded by Nazi Germany, and everyone's like, "What?" You know, we were with them, but rival fascists, rival nationalists, you know, will end up in conflict with one another over who is really supreme. And so Donald Trump is doing this. He's flexing this kind of power, and it's sending the Canadian right, who are trucker convoy, fuck Trudeau, that's their whole bread and butter now, is that kind of far right Trumpist kind of thing. And they don't know how to react now that Trump is sort of turning that attitude against them. And I think that really favors, in a very, very funny and absurd way, that favors the Liberals, who now have, you know, they've got a campaign. And if Chrystia Freeland wins...
I have to ask this question, this question, which is, in terms of how the Liberal Party keeps doing it, how they keep getting elected, do you think that there is not so much a liberal bias in Canada as right-wingers who support the Conservative Party and socially conservative Canadians and those who read the National Post and their local Post media branch in whatever province, but that there is a liberal party bias in Canadian media broadcast and to an extent print media. I mentioned the example of I mentioned the example of Kim Campbell and the face ad against Jean Chretien, the use of Andrew Scheer's anti-abortion views. Also, you know, Trudeau. I mean, anybody who has ever watched any prime minister's debates, even before the Reform Party came about, there's an obsession of a boring conversation about deficits this and deficits that. Tom Mulcair, you know, said that he was going to balance the budget and so forth, and he was going to take care of the deficit problems. Then here you have Justin Trudeau, who says, "I'm going to let deficits." He broke the deficit rule. He said, "We're going to have deficits. We're going to have a lot of social spending. We're going to have deficits." And he still got endorsed by the big newspapers and magazines and so forth. So, yeah. So, do you think that there is a Liberal Party bias in the media in which, and that's why the Liberal Party keeps getting elected? When if this was the NDP running like this, everybody would say that, see, this is why you can't trust the NDP federally.
I would say there is a bias in you know, the oligarch-owned media. There is a bias for the party that seems like it can best run the oligarchy, that it can best defend and represent the oligarchy, and that is usually the Liberals and the Democrats. Like, it is normally the case under most circumstances that you know, the Liberal Party is the party of capitalism. Liberalism is the ideology of capitalism. And so the print media, you know, the legacy media in Canada, the CBC, yeah, I would say there is a certain Liberal Party bias, but only insofar as their bias is for whoever they think can run capitalism the best for them, right? The best for the oligarchy. And in moments where they don't, in moments where they lose faith in that, they will flip. They do flip. You know, when Justin comes out and says, "Yeah, I'm going to do social spending," it's in a moment where I think the oligarchy recognized that they needed to do some social spending. For capitalism, they needed to do some things because they were sliding into a very serious recession after the 2008 crisis. So there was a sense of like, okay, at least this guy's got some answers. At least this guy has a plan. So I think that is where the bias is. The bias is for, the most rational governance of capitalism. However, and again, this is related to what I was saying about Trump, we're also entering the broader political crisis of the collapse of empire. And what comes with that is very irrational expressions of oligarchic power and oligarchic ideology. Donald Trump represents an irrational expression of the aspirations of the oligarchy, blended with a kind of populism that he, uses to build his electoral base. The Conservative Party represent in many ways a more irrational, and certain sections of the Conservative Party especially, a more irrational version. And the more that they go in that direction, the more they sort of lean towards the far right, the more they become an irrational expression of the desires of the oligarchy.
But how
So,
much? But how much does the left in Canada dig their own graves, either by supporting the Liberal Party or voting for them tactically? And all of this despite the track record of the Liberal Party on anything and everything. Left-leaning folks, figures, and green groups, even members of marginalized groups, vote Liberal. I'm curious your response on that.
oh, I mean, yeah, like Youri, I think you know what I think of this. Like, if this was, when it comes to digging their own graves, the left has dug, a hole to China. Like
That's
there are
unbelievable.
so,
It's really unbelievable. I mean,
yeah,
but yeah, continue with what you're
there's
saying.
so many ways. There's so many ways that, the North American left broadly has failed, and certainly that is true in Canada too. And they're different. There's different ways that different sections of the left have failed. I think the more radical left failed by embracing a kind of anarchistic, social movement-ish model of political activism in the late 90s and early 2000s, which stayed kind of with it throughout and ever since, really, and
Can,
has never shaken that.
can you actually expand a bit more on that? I'm very curious what you mean by that.
There's a repudiation of party politics.
Yeah,
After the fall of the Soviet Union, there's a kind of general sense on the more, and I'm talking about the more radical left, not the NDP left,
yeah.
but the more radical left, people who believe in anti-capitalism meaningfully, people who radically want to transform society. But the model that took over was this kind of like, we don't want to have anything to do with the Soviet Union, the big political party, a big communist party that's in charge of everything. We don't want to have hierarchical leadership. In fact, we don't want to have leaders at all. We're going to be a leaderless movement. We're going to organize horizontally. We're not going to have any kind of, the organizations are going to be very loose. It's not an organization, it's a movement. It's just a movement. There's an emphasis on spontaneity, on insurrection, instead of a long-built, slowly organized revolution. It's about insurrection, moments of people power in the street, but without being tied into a self-conscious political program to overthrow the state and rebuild it and reconstruct it along revolutionary lines.
Interesting.
And I would say that's been the dominant model of left organizing really since the 1990s, and it hasn't shifted. Now, in the last 10 years, there have been attempts, I think. There is a sense of the way that has failed, and so there's been attempts to rebuild a kind of political party-based, those kinds of structures that would then, act as a way of consolidating and building from moments of left-oriented or left expressions of insurrection or anger. Something like Palestine. In the last year and a half, there's been, or it's been longer than that, I guess, but but certainly, in this last wave of Israeli genocide, there has been massive, massive swelling of support for Palestine, which reflects a left kind of ethos, a left kind of politics. Not everyone who supports Palestine is a leftist, but
Hmm.
a lot of people who support Palestine are at least sympathetic to the left and will be sympathetic to other things that the left would want. And so you have this moment where it's like, okay, there's a lot of people, but it's not getting harnessed into a broader project that would fight not only for the freedom of Palestine, but for the freedom of Indigenous people here, for an end to Canadian imperialism around the world, for an end to the domination of bosses over workers, for all of those things that are related. And there is no political party that's harnessing that. So I think that's the failure of very generally speaking, that's the failure of the radical left. If we're talking about the failure of the kind of the center left, I mean, at some level, I don't think the NDP wants to govern. I don't think they have any interest. Like, I don't, if and I always get in trouble because I always say these things too disparagingly. But the NDP is not a left party, so I think the NDP is where we go when we're hopeless. We go to the NDP when we've given up on the possibility of creating a better world, and we want to soothe ourselves with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could somehow, use the NDP to leverage the Liberals in a context of a minority government to pass a few bills that might make life slightly better for a few people. Which, okay, I mean, listen, that sometimes occasionally happens. It didn't happen very much in this last stretch, but I think that's where people go to when they're hopeless. I
That's
think when they
quite
run
bit.
out of hope, they go there.
It's quite shocking. I have two more questions, so let me ask this follow up question before I get to these last two questions. We talk about how the Liberal Party keeps doing it, but I find it quite shocking because I think when we talk about the ridiculous tactical voting now, I understand kind of going back to what you were saying about the radical left. So I understand if you're a radical leftist, why you would never vote for the Liberal Party. I certainly would never vote for the Liberal Party, but but wouldn't voting NDP, regardless of how bad such and such an NDP MP is on this socio-economic policy and foreign policy, that's a much more constructive protest vote than tactical voting, which I think is literally scoring an own goal, all the time. And when Glenn Ford, the late Glenn Ford, used to say about the Democratic Party that they're the more effective evil. That is the Liberal Party in a nutshell. So, I'm just baffled as to why green groups, members of marginalized community. It could be indigenous groups. It could be queer liberationist groups. It could be feminist groups. It could be all of the above, even. Why they continue to support the Liberal Party, given the track record of the Liberal Party, but especially since the 70s, since Pierre Trudeau, that party has only gone ever more to the right, kneecaps the movement. I'm curious your response to that before I get to my last two questions.
Hopelessness again. I mean, that is my answer. Hopelessness, tactical voting, to stop the conservatives because the liberals will somehow be a little bit better than the conservatives is hopelessness. It's an act of absolute. And I say this. I'm often very disparaging about this, but I also think it's real. Hopelessness is real. There are reasons to be hopeless. I feel them myself all the time. And so, if you have accepted a certain level of nothing's ever going to get better, nothing is ever going to radically change, then you start to, I guess, negotiate with yourself about what are the little ways, what are the best sort of tactical things that you can do, to make things slightly better and to feel like you're pushing things slightly better. If you have already arrived at a hopelessness about anything real being changed. And in that moment, it's like, yeah, okay. But I agree with you, Youri. I think that the protest vote for the NDP is the better sort of statement. But within the context of hopelessness, I understand why an organization might say, well, the Conservatives will for sure cut our funding. The Liberals will probably cut our funding, but they might wait a little longer, or they might they might say something nice about us while they cut our funding, whereas the Conservatives will laugh at us while they cut our funding. I mean, it's these kind of, I think, very, very, you're dealing in these tiny little micro differences between the ruling class parties because you're hopeless about the prospect of anything else. And though I am often very disparaging of that, I do understand hopelessness. I do understand. I mean, I think it's wrong, and I think that it's a betrayal of everyone who continues to struggle, of everyone who continues to be a victim of this system, whether in downtown Winnipeg or in Palestine, of everyone who continues to not even have a choice but to be in the fight. We have a responsibility to continue to be in the fight in a real way and not give up hope and just vote for the Liberals or NDP out of laziness or to make ourselves feel good. But I understand to a certain extent why people make those choices.
Second to last question. Sorry if this is a repetitive question, which is, but I gotta ask it, which is, why do you think the NDP just hasn't been able to unseat the Liberals at a federal level? And depending on when the world ends through climate change or accidental nuclear war, hopefully not in my lifetime, or both actually. I think yeah, most likely that scenario would probably be both. But why do you think that the NDP hasn't been able to unseat the Liberals at a federal level and end them, just like whatever incarnation of the Tory party where you had Reform and Canadian Alliance? Why haven't the NDP been able to do a version of what Reform and Canadian Alliance did to the Progressive Conservatives, to the Liberal Party?
Because the trend in electoral and the trend in Canadian politics has been since the 1970s to the right, further and further and further and further to the right. So when Reform and Canadian Alliance and so on were emerging, they were emerging to the right of the Conservatives, and that's where everything's going anyways. So in the end, it was the kind of the red Tories that had to adapt and move to the right and become part of this new wave of further right-wing conservatives. The NDP, if, and again, I don't believe they are, but if the NDP were meaningfully interested in pulling things back to the left, they'd be swimming against stream, right? I mean, even as I said, right now, the narrative about the Liberal Party is that Justin Trudeau was too far left, and they have to go further right. So, I mean, they're all just desperately scrambling.
Which is so ridiculous, given that he's not raised people's wages. He's not given McDonald's workers a 15-hour, let alone a 20-hour minimum wage, which they deserve. Income inequality has only gotten bigger and bigger. That's his legacy, along with along with liberals like Chretien and Paul Martin. And yeah, so I'm astonished that people. I'm even astonished that people think that the Liberal Party is even too woke. And I do know what that stupid dog whistle means, but they're not.
No,
They're simply
no,
not. But
exactly.
But
so it's that, and I would say, I would add that I also, at some level, I firmly believe the NDP is absolutely terrified of the idea of ever having any real power. I mean, they absolutely, it's like any opportunity, and we talked about opportunities. From time to time, along the last 10 years, there have been opportunities where Jagmeet Singh might have had an opening where the public would have been receptive to a more left-wing position. And if he had taken that opportunity, if he'd seized that moment, it probably would have gained favor for the NDP. He actually could have, by being more left-wing, built the NDP. But the NDP is terrified of that. That is the last thing the NDP wants. They do not want to become more popular by becoming more left-wing, because they are not left-wing. Because the people that run the NDP are not left-wing. They will not be. Even if it would gain them votes, they wouldn't want to do that.
popular Al Jazeera columnist Andrew Mitrovica, who writes a lot on the Canadian topics for Al Jazeera English, has often described the NCB as the pretend socialist party.
And even that's generous.
And you know,
They're a pretend centrist policy.
but 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 you know, but, you know, hypothetically, if it was Trudeau versus Pierre Poilievre, Jagmeet Singh versus Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre, I mean, you may dislike his political positions, but the man excites the Conservative Party base. I mean, you read the National Post and you read any of Postmedia's local papers, the Toronto Sun, Winnipeg Sun, Montreal Sun. They are excited about Pierre Poilievre. I mean, Justin Trudeau, that new car smell of his, which I never believed in. I always thought he was the white Obama, which I actually think is an insult to Obama because Trudeau is so just airheaded. I mean, when there was popular protests again about the mass graves of children from residential schools, the only thing Justin Trudeau did was, look, my governor general is of an indigenous background. I mean, how tone deaf do you have to be? And then Jagmeet Singh, look, I've been following him the last several years. There is just no enthusiasm. The guy sounds bored that he has to do this job, and so look, I mean, it's so I think Pierre. That's why I think we are going to have a conservative party comeback, and even if it's not a huge comeback, it is going to be a minority government, and I just think that again, sorry to my fellow Canadians of the left, but the future does look very bleak when because I know when we see how the Liberals and the NDP are still only turning ever rightwards, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I think, the last thing I would say on it is just that, the NDP themselves, I think, almost engage in the same sort of tactical support of the Liberals that you described earlier. It's like half the time I think Jagmeet is afraid to criticize Justin Trudeau because that will only play to the advantage of Pierre Poilievre. And yeah, listen, they're not a party that exists with any intention of really having an impact. I think they sort of at this point just exist to continue existing. They're not a relevant force. I'm so sorry to partisans of the NDP.
My final question is this: what does it say about Canadian political culture, the mentality of the Liberal Party of Canada, which often hoodwinks left-leaning or socially liberal-minded folks to keep voting for them, uh, when we don't see that level of success in the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain, in places like Japan, where the center right parties are dominant, the Liberal Democratic Party, it seems, especially if we look at the period at the end of the 1970s, 1980s onwards, the supposedly center left or liberal parties or liberal parties only seem to get in power if they run an economic right-wing program like the Democrats in the U.S., Labour in Britain, New Zealand, Australia, and similar places. Your thoughts and my follow-up question is: are Canadians simply smarter in what the promise of a liberal democracy is, which is the free market is the only game in town, and if you want some kind of fairness, you vote for a party that at least champions noblesse oblige, and that is the Liberal Party of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. There's a lot to respond to, and I think a lot of what you're saying resonates at some level. I don't know how much I agree, but I certainly think some of it resonates. I mean, I think what I would come back to as a kind of a closing thought on Canadian political culture and why the Liberal Party is been so dominant for so long is that it just it has made itself an indispensable representation of the Canadian oligarchy. And it has done so with a degree of flexibility in terms of how it presents itself. Its governance has always been what is best for capital in this moment, and in the next moment, and in the next moment, what is best for capital. And that's especially true on an international stage, but that's, obviously also true domestically. But it has had I think there have been people within that party that had the political acumen to understand that it had to be flexible in terms of its presentation. It had to pivot to the U.S. at a certain point. It had to make a pivot towards the U.S. and away from Britain. It had to be seen to be doing that, but it also had to do that in a way that didn't seem like it was subservient to the U.S., but becoming a partner in this broader kind of Cold War context. It then had to reinvent itself in the 70s and 80s as the party of nationalism. As I said, Pierre Trudeau's government is a nationalist, and they're constructing a Canadian nationalism. And they construct a Canadian nationalism that is amenable to the Liberal Party. They construct a Canadian nationalism that's all about how nice Canada is, how decent it is, what a good neighbor, how involved it is in peacekeeping. It's not a warlike country, but it's a peace-oriented country. The Liberals construct a national narrative that kind of plays into what the Liberal Party wants to do, which is talk kind of nice, but be actively involved everywhere in the world in protecting Canadian interests, protecting the interests of capital in general and Canadian capital specifically. And so, I think what the Liberal Party has often done is cleverly pivot, cleverly rebrand, and make sure that it always taps into, what will land with the electorate in order to keep doing what it's always done, which is govern for the oligarchy. And I think that they will keep doing that. And I genuinely think that, well, right now it doesn't look good for them. And certainly, a few weeks ago, I would have said we're probably entering a stretch of conservative governments. I would not be surprised if Donald Trump's, approach continues, and if a tariff war, looms, and threats of annexation continue, and if there's an annexation of Greenland or these things that Trump is sort of doing out of, I would argue, imperial desperation. This plays into the hands of the Liberals electorally. It plays into the hands of the Liberals. And it might mean that they're able to pivot and become the party that stands up to Donald Trump, and have that be what they, present themselves as. And Freeland presents herself as standing up to the fascist south of the border, which would be very ironic in her case, because she has on more than one occasion stood up and applauded for real fascists, real actual fascists. One
Mark,
who participated in the Holocaust.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just have to mention this. Mark Carney was the former governor of the Bank of England, and like Michael Ignatieff, he has spent way too much time outside of Canada. That technocratic approach to the Canadian economy is not going to fly well with many people. Chrystia Freeland, aka Hysteria Freeland, former junk journalist and resident ultra-Ukrainian nationalist who is the proud grandchild and child of a Ukrainian Nazi collaborator and fascist. Her grandfather ran a newspaper, an anti-Semitic newspaper, which he inherited after Ukrainian collaborators evicted a Jewish publisher from his place. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it would be ironic for her, of all people, to sort of, campaign on standing up to the fascist bully in the U.S. But that's what liberals do. They are chameleons. They chameleon their way into whatever political opportunity is there, where they can make a little bit of hay with the electorate. Well, always, the eye is on the goal of managing the Canadian economy and managing Canadian politics to the advantage of the Canadian oligarchy as best they can. So I think that, that's certainly probably going to be their approach. And listen, whoever wins the next election in Canada, we're entering a period of serious crisis. And in some ways, it's a bad time to be a pundit because all bets are off. A lot of things can change, and they can change
But couldn't
quickly in moments like this.
couldn't this nightmare end if all the people power groups just stopped voting for the Liberal Party? And I'm not saying that the NDP is our savior, but at least use that as a protest vote and at least like mobilize the NDP to push for left stuff, which you're not going to get with the Liberal Party. Like, let's end that. Let's end the political match fixing of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, and if some new left party can emerge.
You're not going to talk me into the NDP, my friend. It's not going to happen. But I mean, listen, if we could get all of these left sort of organizations to cooperate, to work together for an actual left program, not the one that the NDP presents, but an actual left program. I'm all for that, and that is obviously what needs to happen. That is the kind of thing we need to be building. So, good luck to us. We've got a lot of work ahead of us.
Alrighty, well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Tyler Shipley. Let me remind people, Tyler is a historian. He is a professor of society, culture, and commerce in the Department of Liberal Studies at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. He holds a PhD in political science from York University. The author of 2 books, which I still need to get: Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras, and Canada in the World, Center of Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. And he has had articles which people definitely need to read in Canadian Dimension, rap.ca, the Canada Files, and socialistproject.ca. And he's also featured in the brilliant docuseries on Canada's history of imperialism, True to the Powerless. Tyler, thank you so much for coming on to talk about the Liberal Party as an institution, their legacy in socio-economic affairs, and other stuff. But folks, Tyler is going to come back on the program because we are actually going to talk again about the Liberal Party of Canada, but we're actually going to delve into what is center capitalism, and we're going to talk about each Liberal prime ministers and their imperial legacy. Because before I end the recording, I think it's also important to note that why is Canada so prosperous? Why does Europe, particularly Western Europe, have such advanced economies? Why is the US the way it is? Why is Britain, despite its grotesque inequality, is the 5th largest economy in the world? Folks, it ain't because they're economic geniuses. A lot of that stuff has to do with apartheid towards the Sami people, apartheid towards Roma people, and a lot of it has to do with grotesque exploitation of what's called the third world when we talk about Africa, Latin America, and so forth. And when we talk about settler colonialism, much of that wealth was stolen and expropriated from Indigenous people. So when we have Tyler back on the program, we're going to talk about the Liberal Party of Canada and each prime minister's imperial legacy. Maybe even talk about their relations with Indigenous people, and that will, I hope, get people to buy Tyler's book about settler capitalism. But until then, Tyler, thank you so much for coming back on the program. I look forward to having you back on. Best of luck with everything, and
Thanks, Youri.
good night and good luck, everyone.
Great to be here. Thanks, my friend. Take care.
Well,